Okay, well, good morning, everybody. It's very good to see you here, and it's very nice for me personally to be here in Dublin. I do represent the occupier on the investor side, I guess, through ISA, the International Sustainability Alliance. We're an alliance of very large corporate companies stretching across Europe, but with property interests throughout the world. They are primarily investors and occupiers like Heineken, investors like Unibail-Rodamco, Corio, and other sort of very large companies. And we've come together to try and deliver a more sustainable property environment for their assets and to lead the way. I think it's very difficult to talk about investment in sustainability in this current economic climate in which we all suffer. But I would say that ultimately it will change, and therefore those companies that take this seriously, particularly from my side of the house, will be the leaders. And things change really dramatically, don't they? I remember my previous roles have always been on the corporate side, heading up large property departments of very large UK companies. My last one was with the banks, with HBOS and Lloyds. And I remember joining HBOS and saying to my wife, "This is a great job, job for life, banks never go bust." 18 months later, we were taken over by Lloyds. So it just shows you how wrong you can be. And it taught me a lesson even at the late stage of my life that actually change happens, and it happens really rapidly. But I think the change actually in the environmental process and the way we view sustainability will be driven ultimately by behavioural change. And I look at the car industry, and it's very instructive. It's really interesting that we should quote the car industry around sustainability. But if you look at the car industry, I'm old enough to remember when the wearing of seatbelts became compulsory. And I remember the outrage that was felt at the time, that why the government should impose restrictions on how I sat in my car. There was even more outrage, and I remember it absolutely distinctly, when they made the wearing of seatbelts compulsory on the back seats. It just seemed inconceivable that the government would want to legislate. Now, if we swept away all that legislation, would any car manufacturer produce a car without safety belts? No. Would anybody buy a car without safety belts? No. We have a substantial switch in behaviour from absolute antagonism to, well, this is the norm. And I think that's where we need to get to in the sustainability in the built environment. It is, I think, ultimately, as I say, the occupiers, the tenants who will determine sustainability in our buildings. But for the moment, I get a sense that it's investors leading it. We have investors like Prupim, who have a sustainability policy in terms of their property investments. Aberdeen Asset Management are right now writing a new sustainability policy. They will only invest in companies that demonstrate a sustainable policy. So they are in the vanguard of sustainability. But I think for this to happen, things have to be made a lot simpler for us to really understand how a building operates. What does it really mean? And I regret to say I actually turn again to the car industry for the way that it demonstrates how things can be made simpler. It is really easy now. Either an electric car has no CO2 emissions, zero. I sort of know that a car with 100 CO2 emissions is probably good, and a car with 300 CO2 emissions is probably bad. I haven't a clue what that means, okay? But I just know what's good and what's bad, and I can make my judgments based on that information. And I think in the property industry, we're a long way away from giving our ultimate customers, the people who buy the properties that you're involved in, either designing or constructing or whatever, from giving them that information. I think the other interesting thing about the car industry is that legislation led the way. It was legislation that certainly in the UK made, for instance, the taxation of the company car taxation policy based on CO2 emissions. So all of a sudden it became incredibly expensive to have a car that had high CO2 emissions. People changed their behaviour because of the costs of that. Admittedly, petrol now has a huge impact as well, the cost of petrol. But I think now people will make their decisions not solely based on the legislation, but actually because they understand the mechanics and they understand what is right to do. This should be a direction for us in the property industry. So I mean, just as an aside, actually, also, I think it's beginning to happen in the tenant sector. I was in Warsaw not so long ago, and I was with an occupier of a large office building, one of the best buildings in Warsaw, and they said, we've got this really cheaply a few years ago. We think the rent's really good for the quality of accommodation, so on and so forth. The thing they hadn't factored in were the costs of running that space. So now, when they move into their next building, when the lease comes to an end, top of the list will not be rent, will not be rates, will not be the council tax or whatever it is in Warsaw. It will actually be the costs of running that building. They want to know, particularly for us, of course, what the energy costs are. And they will base their decision on that. Energy costs, the maintenance costs of buildings, all of a sudden they are the most important aspects. And I think you will see tenant behaviour driven by that. So how do we apply the simplicity of the car industry to our industry? And I mean, there are lots of ways that ICE, my own organisation, we benchmark, we have KPIs and so on. I have a funny feeling, actually, that EPCs, energy performance certificates, are a real way forward. At the moment, they are applied inconsistently across the whole of Europe, so it is not possible really to compare one building in one country to another building in another country. But when we get that simplicity of EPCs, when we actually know that they do really reflect the energy performance of a building, I think you will find companies using them to make their investment decisions. Why be in, say, why be in, well, actually, France will be a fairly cheap location, probably from an energy perspective, because of currently their nuclear policy. But you would compare France with Germany, with Ireland, and with other countries in Europe based on that. So if I sort of leave you with a message, it is that I think we all need to work towards that simplistic approach so that your customers, the ultimate users of your properties, whether they are residential or commercial, really understand the environmental performance of that property and can make their decisions accordingly. Thank you very much.